He was not reckless because he was evil. He was reckless because he had liquidity and no framework for it. That sentence describes the prodigal son. It also describes the majority of lottery winners, professional athletes, and inheritance recipients in the modern era. The pattern is not a character flaw. It is a financial architecture failure, and Luke 15 documents it with a precision that most financial analysts have never noticed, because most financial analysts have never read it as a balance sheet. We are going to read it that way today, not as a guilt trip, not as a sermon illustration about coming home to God, though that dimension is real and we will not pretend it is not there, but as a case study, a financial autopsy, because buried inside one of the most famous stories Jesus ever told is a complete model of how wealth is destroyed, how a liquidity crisis unfolds, how recovery actually begins, and what the Father's response reveals about the biblical theology of debt forgiveness and restoration. Stay with us, because the last section of this analysis, the Father's response, is the part that will change how you think about both money and grace. Luke 15:12. Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. Before we get to what happened with the money, we need to understand what this request actually was in its first-century economic context, because the modern reader hears, "Give me my inheritance," and imagines a family conversation. The original audience heard something far more disruptive. In ancient Jewish law, inheritance was governed by Deuteronomy 21:17, which established the firstborn's right to a double portion. For a two-son household, that meant the elder received 2/3 and the younger 1/3 of the estate. The prodigal son's request was not simply premature, it was a request for the liquidation of his father's estate while the father was still living and working. Think about what that means economically. The father's estate was almost certainly land-based. First-century Palestinian wealth was not held in financial instruments. It was held in productive agricultural land, livestock, olive groves, and the labor networks attached to them. To give the younger son his share, the father had to either sell productive assets, partition the land in a way that reduced its productive capacity, or find some combination of both. This is the first financial lesson embedded in the text. The prodigal son did not just ask for money. He asked his father to convert illiquid productive assets into liquid capital, and in doing so, he forced a partial liquidation of the household's wealth-generating infrastructure. The father complied. Luke tells us he divided his property between them. Both sons received their portions. The elder son's 2/3 presumably remained in land and livestock. The younger son's 1/3 was converted, liquidated, into a portable, spendable form. Now, here is the question worth sitting with. Why did the father agree? The text does not tell us, and we should resist the temptation to fill that silence with a prosperity gospel answer, that the father's generosity was rewarded with return. What the text shows us is a father who honored his son's agency, absorbed the economic cost of that honor, and waited. That posture, absorbing cost, honoring agency, waiting, is going to matter enormously when we reach the father's response in section 8. If you want to work through the full framework we are building today, the inventory, the reserve structure, the household operating system, there is a 30-day workbook that walks it out in writing. The link is in the description. I will come back to it once later. Now, the text. Luke 15:13 gives us the most compressed financial destruction narrative in all of Scripture. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. Not many days later. That phrase is doing enormous financial work. It tells us the velocity of departure was high, He did not deliberate. He did not plan. He did not build a framework for managing the capital he had just received. He converted, he moved, and he spent. Behavioral economists have a name for what happens when people receive a sudden influx of liquid capital without a pre-existing spending architecture. They call it windfall spending behavior. The research on lottery winners, sudden inheritances, and large insurance settlements consistently shows the same pattern. The absence of a prior framework for managing capital is more predictive of loss than the amount received.
The prodigal son had received a significant inheritance, 1/3 of a productive estate. He had no framework for it. He moved it far from the accountability structures of home, the elder brother, the father, the community that knew him, and he spent it in a way the text describes with a single Greek word, asotos. Translated reckless living or loose living, the word's root means without saving, literally the absence of a preservation instinct. He did not save. He did not invest. He did not build. He spent, and he spent fast. Now, and this is important, the text does not itemize his expenditures. The older brother later accuses him of spending it on prostitutes, but Luke's narrator does not confirm this. We should be careful not to add moral detail the text does not supply. What the text does confirm is the outcome. The capital was gone. Entirely. In a period short enough that he had not yet built any local relationships of depth or reciprocity.
The financial lesson here is not, do not spend money on sinful things. It is more precise than that. He destroyed his capital at a velocity that outpaced his ability to build any alternative income structure. He was spending principal without generating yield, and when the principal was exhausted, he had nothing. No assets, no income, no network, no safety reserve. That is not a moral failure unique to the ancient world. It is a structural failure that repeats in every generation. Luke 15:14. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. Two things happened simultaneously, and the text presents them as a compound event. His personal capital was exhausted, and the macroeconomic environment collapsed. This is the anatomy of a true liquidity crisis. It is not simply that he ran out of money. It is that he ran out of money precisely when the external environment made recovery most difficult. There was no slack in the system, no reserve, no asset to liquidate, no relationship to draw on, at the exact moment when the environment demanded all three. Financial planners in the modern era talk about sequence of returns risk, the danger that a market downturn will hit precisely when you are most exposed. The prodigal son experienced the ancient equivalent. His personal sequence was catastrophic, maximum exposure at the moment of maximum external stress.
And notice what the text says he did next. He went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to feed pigs. He did not return home. He did not ask for help from the friends he had entertained. He found the lowest available labor market entry point and took it. This tells us something important about his psychology at this moment. He still had enough pride, or enough shame, to prefer feeding pigs in a foreign country to returning home in failure. That psychological state is worth naming because it is one of the most common barriers to financial recovery that exists. The shame of the collapse becomes a second crisis layered on top of the first. Luke adds a detail that is almost unbearable in its specificity. He was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. He was not just poor, he was hungry enough to want pig food. And no one, not the citizens of the country, not the friends who had eaten at his table, extended any relief. This is the text's quiet indictment of what the prodigal son had built with his capital, a social network based entirely on consumption rather than mutual obligation. When the consumption stopped, the network dissolved. He had purchased companionship, not community, and companionship, unlike community, has no reserve. Comment below. Have you ever been in a season where you realized the people around you were there for what you could provide, not for who you were? Drop a 1 if yes, a 2 if no. I read every single one.
Luke 15:17. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger?" He came to himself. That is one of the most important phrases in the entire parable. And it is financial before it is spiritual. What it describes is the moment when accurate information finally penetrated the psychological defenses that had been sustaining the dysfunction. He had been operating on a distorted information set. While he was spending, the information his brain was processing was, "I have resources, I have friends, I have options." The famine and the pig field forced a recalibration. The new information was, "I have nothing. Those were not friends, and my father's servants eat better than I do." This recalibration, the moment when reality overrides the narrative we have been telling ourselves about our financial situation, is one of the most underexamined moments in personal finance. It is the moment when someone finally looks at the actual numbers instead of the story about the numbers. It is the moment when the credit card statement gets opened instead of ignored. It is the moment when the business owner admits the model is not working instead of projecting optimism. It is painful, and it is the beginning of recovery. Notice what he does immediately after this recalibration. He makes a plan. "I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.'" This is not a vague intention. This is a structured proposal with a specific ask: hired servant status. He has assessed his situation accurately. He has no claim on sonship. He has forfeited the inheritance. He has no leverage. And he has constructed the most reasonable offer available to him. He is not asking for restoration. He is asking for employment. That is financial sobriety. And it is worth noting that this clarity came not from a seminar or a self-help book, but from sitting in a pig field long enough that the noise of denial finally went quiet. The financial principle here is one we do not talk about enough. Accurate assessment is the prerequisite for recovery, not optimism, not faith in the abstract. Accurate assessment of what you have, what you owe, what your options actually are, and what you can reasonably ask for. The walk home is not a minor narrative detail. It is a financial and psychological gauntlet, and Luke's pacing of it is deliberate. He had to travel back across the same distance he had traveled in the opposite direction, presumably through the same country where he had spent everything, past people who may have known him at his height and now saw him at his lowest. Every step of that journey was a confrontation with the evidence of his own decisions. This is the part of financial recovery that no spreadsheet captures: the sustained discomfort of moving toward accountability after a period of avoidance. It is the equivalent of calling the creditor you have been ignoring for 6 months. It is the meeting with the financial advisor you have been too ashamed to schedule. It is the conversation with the spouse you have not been honest with about the actual numbers. The prodigal son rehearsed his speech as he walked. Luke tells us this twice, once in the pig field when he composed it, and again in verse 21 when he delivers it. He did not improvise. He prepared. He knew what he was going to say. He knew what he was asking for. And he knew what he was not going to ask for.
That preparation matters. When you approach a creditor, a bank, a family member, a business partner, after a period of failure, the quality of your approach shapes the quality of the response. Coming with a specific, realistic proposal is categorically different from coming with a vague apology and an outstretched hand. He was not coming to renegotiate the inheritance. He was not coming to explain why the famine was not his fault. He was not coming to minimize what had happened. He was coming with a clear acknowledgement of what he had done and a specific, modest ask for a path forward. Now here is something worth sitting with.
This is the channel's most requested topic. What does biblical financial recovery actually look like in practice? The 30-day workbook I mentioned earlier has a full week built around exactly this: the inventory, the honest accounting, the one-page household plan you actually sign. What I just walked you through is the theological foundation. The workbook is where you do it on paper, with your own numbers. The link is in the description. The 4-column inventory sheet, the reserve structure, the spending ceiling, 30 days of it. That is the one place I will point you to it, and it stands entirely on its own. If this teaching is landing for you, hit that subscribe button right now, because next week we go deeper into another financial case study from Scripture that most Bible teachers never reach. And if you want to be praying for the people in this community who are in their own walk home right now, drop the word restore in the comments. I will read every single one. Luke 15:20. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. The father was watching. He was positioned to see his son coming from a distance. That detail is not accidental. It tells us the father had not moved on, had not closed the account, had not written off the relationship. He was watching the road. But let us stay in the financial register for a moment, because what happens next is one of the most theologically and economically significant sequences in the New Testament. The son delivers his prepared speech. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." He does not finish it. Luke tells us the father interrupted him before he could make his ask for hired servant status. And then the father does 4 things in rapid succession. He calls for the best robe, a ring, sandals for his feet, and a fatted calf for a celebration. In the economic language of the first century, each of these carries specific weight. The robe, a restoration of status. The son came home in rags, the visible evidence of his failure. The father covered it with the best the household had. He did not make the son earn new clothes. He gave him the best ones. The ring, almost certainly a signet ring, the ancient equivalent of a signature authority. A signet ring gave its wearer the ability to make binding transactions in the father's name. The father was not just restoring the son's dignity, he was restoring his economic agency. The sandals. In the ancient world, slaves went barefoot. Sandals were the marker of a free person. The father was making an explicit statement about the son's status. Not servant, not slave, not hired hand. Son. The fatted calf. A significant economic expenditure. A calf kept specifically for a feast was capital deployed for celebration, not a modest welcome home dinner, but a community event that publicly announced the son's return and restoration. Taken together, the father's response is not a sentimental gesture. It is a comprehensive debt forgiveness and restoration package. The son came home expecting to negotiate employment terms. The father responded by canceling the debt entirely and restoring full standing. This is the economic theology of grace, and it is radically different from the financial systems most of us operate in.
In every human financial system, debt forgiveness is partial, conditional, and reputation damaging. The debtor who has a debt forgiven carries the record of it. The relationship is altered. The trust is rebuilt, slowly, if at all. The father's response models something different: unconditional restoration of standing, not because the son had earned it, but because the father chose to absorb the cost of the loss and extend full reinstatement anyway.
We cannot do an honest financial autopsy of this parable without examining the elder son, because his response reveals something about the economics of resentment that is just as instructive as his brother's collapse. Luke 15:25-28. The elder son comes in from the field, hears music and dancing, asks what is happening, is told his brother has returned and the father has thrown a feast, and he refuses to go in. His complaint, when the father comes out to him, is explicitly economic. "Look, these many years I have been serving you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat, that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." Notice the elder son's financial framework. He has been operating on a merit-based accounting system. Years of service should produce proportional reward. His brother's failure should produce proportional consequence. The father's response violates both sides of that ledger simultaneously. It rewards failure and ignores faithfulness, and the elder son finds it economically incomprehensible. He is not wrong about the math. He is wrong about the framework. The father's response to him is one of the most quietly devastating lines in the parable. "Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours." In other words, you already have it all. You have had access to everything this whole time. The feast for your brother does not diminish your inheritance. It was already secured. This is a profound financial reframe. The elder son had been living as though the father's estate were a fixed sum to be divided, and every resource given to his brother was a resource taken from him. The father's response reframes the estate as something already fully available to the elder son. His brother's restoration came at the father's cost, not at his. The elder son's resentment is the economics of scarcity applied to a relationship of abundance. And it is worth asking, honestly, how often do we apply scarcity thinking to situations where the framework is actually abundance? This might be the most uncomfortable question in the whole parable. Drop a comment below. Have you ever found yourself in the elder son's position, doing everything right and resenting someone else's restoration? Be honest. I think more of us have been there than would admit it. We have been building toward this. The entire financial autopsy of Luke 15, the liquidity crisis, the velocity of destruction, the macro shock, the moment of clarity, the journey home, all of it is prologue to what the Father's response reveals about the biblical theology of debt, forgiveness, and restoration. Let us be precise about what the Father absorbed. He absorbed the initial cost of liquidating productive assets to fund his son's departure. He absorbed the ongoing loss of that capital while his son was spending it, the lost yield, the reduced estate capacity, the economic disruption of the partial liquidation. He absorbed the social cost of a son who had publicly dishonored the family. And then, when the son returned, he absorbed the cost of the restoration, the robe, the ring, the sandals, the feast. At no point did he require repayment. At no point did he extract a confession as the price of admission. At no point did he negotiate terms. He saw his son coming from a distance and ran toward him before the son could even begin his prepared speech. The Greek word Luke uses for the father's response when he sees his son is splanknitsomai, often translated
felt compassion, but rooted in a word meaning the visceral organs, the gut. This is not a polite, managed emotional response. It is the kind of feeling that moves the whole body. The father did not deliberate, he ran. Now, what does this mean financially? What is the text actually saying about how debt and restoration work in the economy of God? Several things, and we should name them carefully. First, the father's forgiveness was not cheap. It cost him. He absorbed every loss without requiring the son to reimburse him. This is the opposite of the prosperity gospel version of restoration, which implies that the father's generosity was ultimately rewarded by the son's return. The text does not say the son rebuilt the estate.
It does not say the family's finances recovered. It says the father threw a party. The restoration was relational and economic in its expression, but the father bore the financial cost of it without any indication of repayment. Second, the restoration was complete, not partial. This is the detail that most financial systems cannot replicate. In human debt forgiveness, the forgiven debt leaves a mark on a credit report, in a relationship, in the memory of the creditor. The father's restoration left no mark. The son was not given a probationary period. He was not placed on a performance improvement plan. He was given the best robe, the signet ring, the sandals, and a seat at the feast. Third, the restoration was initiated by the father, not earned by the son. The son came home with a proposal, hired servant status. The father overrode the proposal entirely. This is theologically significant. The son's plan for his own recovery was smaller than what the father had in mind. The son was negotiating from a position of accurate self-assessment, which is good. But the father's response was not bounded by the son's self-assessment. This is the part that is hardest to translate into financial application without sliding into prosperity gospel territory, so let us be careful. The parable is not saying that if you repent of financial failure, God will restore your bank account. It is not a promise of material recovery. What it is saying, in the register of economic language that the original audience would have understood immediately, is that the restoration available in the economy of God operates on a different logic than the restoration available in human financial systems. Human financial recovery is earned, partial, and marked. The biblical model of restoration, at least as modeled by the father in this parable, is initiated, complete, and unmarked. What does this mean practically for those of us navigating financial hardship or recovery right now? It means the shame you are carrying about past financial failure is not the framework the text offers. The son carried his shame all the way home and prepared a speech built entirely around it. The father interrupted the speech. He was not interested in a detailed accounting of the failure. He was interested in the return. That is not an excuse for avoiding honest assessment. We spent an entire section on the importance of accurate accounting and realistic proposals. But it is a correction to the idea that the depth of your failure determines the ceiling of your recovery. The father ran. He absorbed the cost. He threw a party. And the text ends, deliberately, provocatively, without telling us whether the elder son ever came inside. That open ending is not an accident. It is an invitation. The question the parable leaves hanging is not, will the prodigal son be okay? He is already at the table. The question is, will the elder son, the one who did everything right, who followed the rules, who resents the restoration, will he come inside? That question is for a different video, but I want you to sit with it. Everything I have laid out today, the liquidity crisis, the velocity of destruction, the moment of clarity, the structured approach to recovery, the theology of the father's response, is one framework.
If you want to work through your own household's financial architecture with the same rigor we applied to Luke 15, the 30-day workbook in the description is where that happens. 94 pages, 4 weeks, 1 biblical operator per week, and it ends with a 1-page household plan you actually sign. The link is in the description below. That is the last time I will mention it, and the teaching in this video stands completely on its own, either way.
If you have made it this far, you are not a casual viewer. You are someone who takes this seriously, both the scripture and the financial reality it speaks into. That is exactly who this channel is built for. Subscribe if you have not already, because every week we go back into the text and pull out something that most financial teachers and most Bible teachers both missed, because they were not reading it together. And if today's case study on the prodigal son landed for you, if the section on the father's response changed something in how you think about debt, recovery, or your own financial situation, leave a like right now. It helps more people find this kind of teaching when they need it most.
The prodigal son came home expecting to negotiate employment. He got the best robe, the signet ring, and a seat at the table, because the father was watching the road before the son ever turned around. Thanks for being here. The end screen has more videos in the same world. Pick whichever video on the end screen calls to you. Every one goes deeper into the text.